Heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. What an interesting show we have lined up for you today, folks. We have several experts, as always. We're going to talk about the cloud computing. The exact title is hybrid cloud, try multi-cloud, partner. And that's just sort of a play on words. Basically, my joke about hybrid cloud versus multi-cloud is that we talked hybrid cloud, 10 years ago or longer, really. And hybrid just refers to the fact that you're going to have these on-premise data centers, traditional data centers, and you'll have something up in the cloud. In the early days, it was Salesforce, right? They're the sort of the poster child of software as a service. In the really old days, we had ASPs, application service providers. No one talks about ASPs anymore. In fact, one of our guests a few years ago made a wise crack I thought was kind of funny. I was like, what's the difference between SaaS and an ASP? And he goes, SaaS works. I was like, oh, okay, I get it. So application service providers, just a term, that we used to use. We've had some technical difficulties today, but we should be able to solve it on the visual side. But yes, indeed, we're going to talk about hybrid cloud. We have several guests. We have Tytus calling in, Kurek from Poland. We have Stephen Thomas as well. And we also have Wally Macdermid, all experts in cloud. And maybe, Wally, I'll throw it over to you first to share your perspectives on this whole definition, hybrid cloud versus multi-cloud. At the end of the day, does it really matter? And what do these things mean to you?
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here. And I think you defined hybrid cloud very well, right? It's the idea that you have some on-prem resources that need to interact with the public cloud in some way. But then a few years ago, this multi-cloud thing started to happen, and I don't know if people really understood it. So then you saw the phrase hybrid multi-cloud, which I'm really not sure exactly what that meant. But when I think about multi-cloud, there may be three ways to look at it. First is, we're all multi-cloud. If I look, we're on Zoom right now. If I look at the favorites tab of my browser, I have Salesforce, I have LinkedIn, I have Gmail. I probably have a dozen different cloud applications. So by definition, Wally is multi-cloud. Right. And I think a lot of businesses find themselves in, by definition, multi-cloud because they've chosen to use business solutions that are just hosted in the cloud.
Right.
Then you get to the more interesting, well, the CFO starts to see that, and she or he is like, well, I don't want to spend all my money with vendor A when there's another alternative. How can I spend a little bit of money with both vendor A and vendor B to get some leverage? I mean, we've seen this, if you've been in IT or any business, you've seen this forever, right? The finance folks and the business folks always try to get some sort of leverage by working with multiple vendors. I was raised in the database world, and I've worked with SQL Server from Microsoft and Oracle, IBM, and you pick the right product sometimes for technical reasons, and you pick a product sometimes because you want leverage over the other guy. So I think to some extent, multi-cloud can be seen as a business decision to manage risk and costs. And then certainly in my business, we see some applications themselves that are multi-cloud, that are truly using data or services across multiple providers at the same time. A few years ago, I think that those were probably unicorns, but we're beginning to see more and more of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And since you mentioned database, we might as well throw that in there too, right? We have all these new database technologies. A lot of them are open source, but Google has its own databases now that it's selling. Amazon, of course, DynamoDB. So there are all these databases now, and some of them are quite fascinating. There's CockroachDB, these incredibly distributed, very durable databases, some of them SQL, some of them not. That's a big change in the marketplace, right? We'll talk about data gravity on this show at some point. And, the fact that wherever you put your data first, if it's going to be a big instance, it's probably going to stay there, because taking huge chunks of data, moving it from one place to another, it's just not efficient. It's not cost effective. You're always going to have something break, it seems to me, because you didn't carefully monitor what was going across. I mean, anytime you move massive amounts of data like that, you're kind of asking for problems. So that's part and parcel to the conversation about data gravity, right? Is if you can leverage these cloud databases, well, why would you even want it on-prem? What do you think?
At least I think you might want it on-prem for security reasons, privacy reasons, regulatory reasons. I normally live in California. I'm currently on an extended visit to EMEA. The Europeans think about data sovereignty in a much different way than I think the Americans. You do see a lot of either regional cloud providers or a move just to keep data on-prem. I think the other reason you might keep it on-prem, back to your point, if I have 10 terabytes of data in the cloud, it actually takes me a decent amount of time to pull that back down.
Right.
If I have 10 petabytes in the cloud and I want to get it back on-prem, I'm going to have to wait a long, long time and spend a lot of money to make that happen.
That's right.
So I think when architecting some of these solutions, the decision is made up front. Well, we are going to have petabytes and petabytes of data. And if we ever want to get it out of cloud A for whatever reason, that's going to be really hard. So maybe we should architect this solution to be on-prem first.
Yeah. And then there's also the edge. Real quick, let's dive into that a little bit before our next guest comes on here. What I'm fascinated by with the edge is the fact that you now have this really wide spectrum of tapestry on which you can paint your applications, right? Like it used to be just on-prem. Now you've got on-prem and these cloud providers that are doing amazing things. And then you've got the edge. Well, from an architectural perspective, I can do it a lot of different ways. If I can do some processing at the edge and then send my signal over the wire, that seems to be probably the best use case, instead of just grabbing all this sensor data and sending all of it over the wire. That's not a very efficient way to do things at all. Exactly. So you really do have all these different options now about how you can construct these applications. And it's very exciting, but it does take some expertise, right?
Yeah, and edge can mean so many different things. Edge can be a Starbucks location, could be an oil rig, could be a military Humvee. The example I like to think about a lot is autonomous cars, because I think most people understand it. The amount of data generated by an autonomous car every mile or every minute is amazing. You can't have all of those cars, as we have millions and millions more of them, sending all of that data all the time to a central location. So there's a model I think these companies are working on where you pull into the filling station, air quotes, and as you charge up, the relevant data is sucked off the car, memory on the car is freed up. Some analysis, to your point, is done at the station.
Wow.
So for example, in San Francisco, California, you might have different driving habits than you would in Knoxville, Tennessee, than you would in Paris. And so there can be some logic within that local charging station that's going to treat that data differently. Say, oh,
interesting.
Parisian drivers are X, so let's do something different with this data. But then eventually the analysis, the summary of that can be sent up to a private core or the public cloud.
Yeah, that's really cool stuff. I mean, it's a fun time to be alive in the industry, right? Because there's so many challenges that you can tackle. I guess one last question I'll throw over to you before we bring in our next guest is, what's your advice for strategic IT planning? Should we be planning out by quarter, by year anymore? Is that too far ahead to look? What are your thoughts on that? I know it varies by business, but generally speaking, how long should I be looking into the future?
That is a tough question to ask. I think there's probably not one right answer. I hate to give you that. There are some industries, businesses, and applications that I think you don't need a super long time horizon. If you need a marketing application, pick one off the shelf, pick one that's available now and go.
Right.
If you're in the banking industry, or we have a client who does fraud detection for credit cards, they need to keep their data for over 10 years. The medical industry would be another good example. If you're architecting for something that has to have a 10 to 20 year life, then absolutely you need to think longer term versus if you have to switch your marketing application in 3 years, apologies to all CMOs who are listening, that's probably a less challenging move than having to change regulations for healthcare in the United States.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. It depends upon your industry, your business model, et cetera. Yeah, good point. All right, next up we have, and stick around for the roundtables, we have Tytus Kurek calling in all the way from Poland, from Canonical. So Tytus, tell us a bit about yourself and what Canonical does and how you see the evolving world of hybrid and multi-cloud.
Sure. Thank you very much, Eric, and hello, everyone. So my role at Canonical is in the product management team. So I'm basically responsible for planning the strategy of our cloud products. And for those of our viewers who don't necessarily know what Canonical is doing, like we are the company behind Ubuntu. So if you haven't heard about Canonical, I'm pretty sure you've heard about Ubuntu. At least this is like the most popular Linux distribution, especially around developers, right? So whenever there's like an enterprise that hires a bunch of software engineers, like usually the platform of choice for them is Ubuntu. And this is where it starts, and this is where it becomes really interesting, because if you're developing your application on Ubuntu, guess like what is the best place to run it then, right? Like it's Ubuntu again, right? So I think the biggest challenge that we are facing when we're talking about like all of those hybrid multi-cloud is like, how do we actually ensure that we can provide our users with the same experience regardless of the cloud platform that they're using? And there are so many cloud platforms around us these days, right? Like in the United States, there are like those 3 big hyperscalers. But when you move to Europe, for example, you're going to see so many smaller public cloud providers, right? Like there's OVH Cloud, there's Linode, there's way more of them. And if we enter regions like MEA or Africa, for example, or Oceania, that there's even more local public cloud providers, right? Like,
that's
and
interesting.
they're all like a good substrate for some of the business applications because of various reasons, right? Like this might be because of compliance, this might be because of local regulations, this might be because of low bandwidth in some regions, high latency. So our challenge is to ensure that people actually get the same experience regardless of their workload run, and that requires partnering with all of those big players. This also spans to like traditional data centers, where we see a lot of VMware software or other traditional proprietary virtualization solutions, as well as open source cloud platforms like OpenStack or Kubernetes, right? And we've also touched a little bit on the edge, which is like growing super fast and is expected to become bigger than public clouds actually at some point. So
that's crazy.
It's it's another interesting challenge, right? So making sure that we can provide a frictionless experience across all of those areas or of those pillars of the infrastructure is a big challenge, and that's something that makes us very busy at Canonical.
Yeah, and I was talking to a vendor this morning out of Israel. They do test data management, TDM, as it's referred to. And you're reminding me of how important it is to have all this automation around your applications and testing them and seeing if they work in this environment, in that environment, especially if you have a multinational corporation that is in the United States and Europe and Africa and all these different places. To your point, making sure that these things work the same way, or at least that users have the same experience, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of domain knowledge. And as you suggest, you have to go partner with consulting firms and cloud providers in these different regions, because there is this ever sort of rolling horizon of innovation out there. And yet there's also this long tail of legacy, which doesn't typically go away very easily, right? What did we joke last year? We did a show called sunsetting applications and other enterprise fairy tales or something like that. It's just really hard to shut down an application once it's running somewhere, right?
Absolutely. So you touched a very interesting point. So having a platform where your application can run on is like just the first step. That's with the amount of applications that businesses are running in the cloud these days, like automation is a necessary thing, is a mandatory thing, right? Like you don't want your engineers to just spend their time manually executing database backups like overnight, right? So the need for automation is even more evident these days, and it's not just about the initial deployment, right? Like putting a database on the cloud and filling it with the data is like is an easy task these days. But operating applications, operating databases, operating more complex solutions like sophisticated AI/ML environments, for example, is what's causing a lot of challenges, right? So there's been an interesting concept that has been raised in the Kubernetes space recently, which is around software operators. Basically, someone's got an idea, so that why don't we actually create a software that would drive other piece of the software, right? So you run your application. How do you operate it? Well, let's create another piece of the software that would actually package all the operations principles for this particular operation. How do you scale it out? How do you backup it? How do you upgrade it? How do you renew certificates? Stuff like that, right? And this has become an evolving concept inside of the Kubernetes space. So basically, Kubernetes operators that has now spawned across other cloud providers as well. So other substrates, basically. So it's no longer like a Kubernetes thing. It's something that can drive virtual machines. It's something that can drive bare metal machines. It's something that can drive your instances in a cloud. And that is evolving towards becoming like a de facto standard for applications operations, right? So getting like a unified experience across various cloud providers is one challenge, but getting a unified way to automate your applications across various cloud platforms is definitely another challenge. But
That's
fortunately,
interesting.
there are tools that exist already.
Yeah, I'd like to get more into that in the next segment or later in the show even. So you're referring to operators. So are these actual, well, we're coming up on a break here, but so what Tytus is talking about here is that you have Kubernetes, which is containers. These little containers have system processes in them, and you launch the container, it does its thing, and then it goes away. It's a very efficient way to scale out and then just kind of scale back as you need to in cloud computing. It's very cool stuff. We'll pick it up after the break, folks. Don't touch that dial. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, having a fantastic conversation about multi-cloud. We heard from Tytus Kurek and let's see, Wally Macdermid in the first segment, and now Stephen Thomas from Virtuozzo. And you were making a great point in the break there about Kubernetes and how Kubernetes operates. It's container orchestration. It's sort of a next generation of virtualization, essentially, which I think is a brilliant move by Google to create this open source project. It sits on top of Docker and allows you to kind of break down your functionality into little system processes inside of a container. And then Tytus was talking about the sidecar concept, which I think is fascinating. But can you explain, because you look like you're about to do a great job of explaining what Kubernetes is doing and how it's operating, essentially. Can you give us a quick overview of that and then tell us what you folks are working on?
Sure, Eric. So I think I'm probably the simple guy in the room for your listeners, so I'll try and break it down in a fairly simplistic way. So I'm here at Virtuozzo. We are effectively purpose-built open stack for system providers, service providers, hosters, et cetera. And so when we were talking at the break about the concept of containers and how people have been modernizing their applications over the last 5-10 years, migrating into the AWS in those worlds, what's happened is people have found the complexity inside of AWS or Azure, GCP to be relatively high. And I think what Tytus was leading to in our break conversation was how you take the concept of virtualizing a server, as VMware did, and it still do very well, and break that down into those smaller bits, which is effectively the container-based approach here. And that's really what both, whether it's Ubuntu, Virtuoso with our distribution of OpenStack and Red Hat, that's really what we do, is that orchestration and scaling of those containers to allow you to break that monolithic application down into those smaller bits. And the thing that's compelling about that today for, I think, a lot of your listeners is largely they want to try and go to public cloud, right? But they may need that phase in between of how do I take a 500 node data center or a 50 node data center in an application and set themselves up for that migration to public cloud. And if they need to in the future, the ability to bring that application back. And we were talking again, Eric, at the break, at the concept of, you look at the AI-based applications, the amount of data that's leveraged to train those applications. And you had mentioned in the abstract for this show, the concept of egress, right? The baggage fees of the public, the hyperscalers. It's those pieces right there are the place where someone like or container-based approach and proximity to someone's location and data can really offer financial opportunities for that particular customer. So again, or applications. So that's kind of where I was trying to go earlier.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so you're OpenStack, right, which is the IBM view of the world, right? And you've got Kubernetes in the sort of the rest of the world. And now Red Hat, of course, is part of IBM. I mean, that was a pretty big move. And IBM gets a lot of credit for having invested very heavily in open source over the years, all the way back to Linux, right? They're the ones who looked at Linux and threw, I think it was $1 billion to harden Linux as an operating system. And then what happens next? I heard they made that money back in like a year or two or something because it stabilized the market. And, when I was first getting into this business in 2005, I was working at the Data Warehousing Institute. And I remember asking one of the analysts, because a press release came out and with some company that had done their first version of an application to run on Linux. I'm like, no, why would it run on Linux first? And he explained it to me back then. He goes, well, because that is now the de facto standard. So that, to me, is a very cool story in and of itself. And if you look at a lot of the innovation that's happening now, almost all of it is open source. Not everything, but a lot of it is open source. And so the magic is how you bring it together and how you customize it to do what you want, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And I think if everybody here is listening and you've stood up an AWS EC2 instance, the reason you've done that is because it's so easy to do. The back end of AWS or Azure is a KVM-based virtualization environment. So it's not like they're recreating brand new technology. What they've done is deliver effectively an application interface on top of those environments to make it easy for customers to consume those worlds. And there are different, application marketplace capabilities that large enterprise hosters, again, can deploy to mimic that experience. But that, you're spot on, again, kind of as you think about how they've done that work and leveraged it to their benefit. And then again, for your listeners out there, as they're thinking about the things that they're facing right now, we talked about this again in the break, is the concept of Broadcom buying VMware. And a lot of these very, very significant data center environments, even in AWS, where you've got significant penetration of virtualized machines running on VMware, that's a place where people are concerned right now and thinking about the alternatives. And that takes you back to using containers as an alternative, using OpenStack, or again in Ubuntu here with Tytus as an alternative method for you to virtualize those environments.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, and I did not realize that this deal is imminent here. I guess it's been a while ago now, so I'm not sure if it is formally closed. But
it's not formally closed, and I think that's created quite a bit of uncertainty in the market for a number of customers and providers.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I remember we in fact talked, I think last week on a show, we were joking about when I think it was on Monday on our other show, Inside Analysis, when Oracle bought Sun Microsystems, which of course had MySQL. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, what's going to happen here? And of course, the very day that Oracle bought Sun, the guy Monty Bedenius, who created MySQL, forked the open source project to create MariaDB, and now that's still a viable. It's they've got SkySQL, all kind of stuff is going on. So it's really fascinating to see how these business decisions affect the trajectory of the solutions, right? And so, yeah, well, here's hoping they figure out what they're going to do, because that is such a big deal. I mean, it's the kind of thing where CTOs and directors of IT are going, "Oh man." Like, please figure it out.
That is something that we see in the market today regularly, Eric, which is our CTO, CIO partners are considering, again, as we talked about, how do I bring that application back? So they're looking at their bills in the current macro environment, right? Everybody's asking everyone in their supply chain, hey, can I find 30% more in cost reduction?
Wow.
And if you're inside of AWS or Azure, you can't really pick up the phone and call Tim or John and say, hey, can you help me out here and reduce some cost? And so that's where we see a lot of these customers thinking differently about their approach to what are the classic hyperscalers, and seeing if they can't migrate using a container-based approach, right? Virtualization in their data center to mimic those same capabilities. And again, Ubuntu, us, OpenStack, others, that's what we all allow those providers to do, is you want that similar experience that you're getting from a hyperscaler from a feature and function perspective, but local to your data center or your regional hoster to try and reduce your cost profile as a CFO or a CIO.
Yeah, what gets me really excited, and this is a bit off topic, but I think I can bring it back in, is this whole concept of process mining. So you've got companies like Celonis, there's Software AG, there's a few others who are talking about it, but it's a fascinating concept where they're tracking the footprints of data and then able to show you what the real process looks like across your ERP system into some other environment, for example. Because once you can characterize that, once you can see what the real process is, that's when you can start rebuilding and refactoring and doing things in different ways. Do you see that as a great enabler for digital transformation? Because for me, it's kind of like the last piece of the puzzle to be able to figure out what's really happening, and then you can know what you can change in order to optimize things. What do you think?
Certainly, that's an opportunity, and I don't think that's dissimilar from how we're using AI inside of large orchestration environments to help minimize number of steps, reduce number of items that need to be deployed, et cetera. To your point, the more we can learn about the data and data flow, the better we get at servicing the application, and that's really what they're trying to do. And again, you can see it across the board where people are beginning to think more aggressively about data flows. Again, as those data sets get bigger and bigger and bigger, which they will continue, the value for a lot of our users out there today is in the data, and they're trying to figure out, how do I monetize that data that exists in my my data center on public cloud, whatever it may be. And that's, again, I think where this group between Wally, Tytus, and myself are really here to help people do that work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a good segue to bring the roundtable, and I'll bring Wally back to kind of comment on that. Once again, it's an amazing time to be in the business, right? But you really have to know your particular business model, your industry, what makes sense for you. Because I think the different clouds are going to, I think this is already starting to happen a little bit. I mean, you look at Oracle and their real huge investment into healthcare, right? I think you're going to start to see some verticalization. But Wally, what do you think?
Well, what you were just talking about and what Stephen mentioned a couple of minutes ago made me think, I don't know if this group is familiar with a company called Cribl, CRIBL, founded by 3 ex-Splunk engineers. They're similar companies. If I understand their value prop correctly, it's pretty interesting. And I think it speaks to this data workflow. So with Splunk, you harvest a bunch of log data, and you have a certain amount of control, but not infinite control over how much data Splunk pulls in. So maybe you're pulling in a 10,000 line log file, but you really only care about 400 lines. Right. Well, guess what? You have to ingest the whole 10,000 line log file over and over again. And guess what Splunk charges you for? Ingesting data. Right. So Cribl comes along and does 2 things. Again, my understanding, apologies to Cribl experts out there. But first, it allows you to better target the data you want to ingest. So you're ingesting the data intelligently, right? So now you're beginning to model and improve your data flows. And then it stores it in a standard object store like my company Scality provides, where then Cribble can pass it along to Elastic or Cloudera or another analytics system. So again, not picking on Splunk, but just the most recent example, but now your massive amount of data is not tied only to Splunk. Splunk's a great product. Now you're intelligently pulling just the data you want, and you can use it with a myriad number of tools. So maybe picking on multi-cloud, it's the multi-analytics tool. Yeah,
it reminds me of Mesmo. Do you know Mesmo? We've done some work with those folks. They're basically a machine data orchestration platform. So they're doing kind of what you're talking about, which is you want to pull data from, let's say, Datadog or from Splunk or New Relic or any one of these observability vendors. And I mean, there are more than you can shake a stick at. In like the last 2 years, it just exploded everywhere, in large part, I think, because of Kubernetes and because of this new way of doing applications through container orchestration. But they have a very clever way of allowing you to, as you suggest, pull the wheat out and not store all the chaff, right?
Well, I think the same is true for DevOps orchestration, Eric and Wally. I mean, while we're talking about data specifically, we're also talking about kind of hyperscalers, multi-cloud, and it goes back to that functionality premise of I get such great functionality from the public cloud and hyperscaler providers today. How can I get that similar experience either local to me through a regional service provider where I can get that white glove experience and or my own data center where I can deliver auto scaling for DevOps, right? Those are the pieces where I think some of the data center providers and enterprise IT teams haven't, I don't want to say they've given up, but they're going back to doing that work and delivering that experience to their internal customers. Because again, that's where they get that increased value, effectiveness of the capital that they've already deployed. Again, a lot of really great things happening in that market today.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'll bring Tytus in. I've got about 2 minutes in this segment. Understanding what you have already is a huge part of the success story, it seems to me, in IT. And so understanding what you have on-prem, understanding what these different cloud providers can offer you, and being able to sort of manage and understand the costs around that. I mean, that's a huge space these days. I would imagine that larger organizations probably have a team focused on just trying to understand what is the TCO of my data center? What is the TCO of this cloud environment, of that cloud environment? It takes a lot of time and effort, and the models are always changing. But Tytus, what are your thoughts around helping companies figure that out?
You are absolutely right. So that some companies even hire dedicated teams to kind of take care of this challenge. And those who are not doing that yet will likely be doing that in the foreseeable future. So I think Stephen made a very good point, so that public clouds enable you to kind of start using them immediately, right? Like at the end of the day, you just need to attach your credit card to the billing system, and then you can use all of those resources, right? But over time, they quickly realize that those costs start inflating as the number of workloads grow, as they move more data to the cloud. And then they're kind of like, well, we embrace public clouds at the first, but now it's time to say goodbye, right? So not surprisingly, we're seeing so many companies repatriating their workloads back to an on-prem infrastructure. Some of them take an opportunity to modernize their workloads to make them fully cloud native. But one of the biggest driving factors behind all of that, as you mentioned, is the cost. So we see more and more companies being aware so that this is something that they need to watch. They introduce like FinOps practices to monitor their costs and make data-driven decisions depending on how much they spend on public clouds compared to what they could be spending if they build like a cost-effective private cloud infrastructure.
That's right. That's exactly right. Private cloud is your data center, right? Well, don't touch that dial, folks. We'll be right back. You are listening to DM Radio.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, talking all things hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. And of course, it just keeps changing by the day. And then the edge we have out there too, which I was surprised to hear that they think the edge could be bigger than public cloud. I mean, Wow, that's pretty interesting. But there's so much innovation. I think that's what's really cool about this is you have all these different pockets of innovation coming out, people coming up with different ways of doing things. And maybe let's see, I'll throw this one over first to, I guess, to Wally, maybe, again, for businesses trying to plan out their next 6 months, their next year, now that thankfully this pandemic thing seems to be behind us. And what frustrates me is that we had fair warning about this stuff with the supply chain troubles in the previous administration with the tariffs on China. I mean, that was a big straw in the wind that says, yeah, there's a hurricane, there's a tornado coming this way. And then, of course, you get COVID, and that really forced companies to rethink supply chain. But that fosters innovation too, right? So, what's your thought? I'm guessing that you just have to keep your mind open about things and try different things and just manage it and watch the costs and watch the functionality, et cetera, right? What do you think, Wally?
Yeah, as we were talking in the break, I think Tytus made the example of so many, right? It's not just you have on-prem or you have public cloud. You have regional hosters, you have colos. The customer's need is for compute power or storage or networking and what have you. Those resources exist somewhere. Clearly, the hyperscalers are sucking up a lot of those resources out of the market, but there are regional providers. There's Akamai. There are a ton of places you can go to, even if you don't have your own data center. So maybe, thinking out loud, is there a personal cloud in our future or a business cloud where is that a different name for a colo? You're letting somebody else manage all your stuff, but you're not giving it all to Amazon. You can actually drive to your data center. You just don't own it. So there are so many different models. We do tend to lump them into the cloud, but there are a lot of different options for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, let's go around the room here. Throw it over to Stephen, maybe. Again, advice to companies. I mean, you're talking, it's the horses for courses thing, right? I mean, you have to sit down with people and figure out fairly quickly, what is your business model? What is your current stack? What are you trying to accomplish? The exciting thing about digital transformation is that just about any darn process these days can and probably should be automated. The question becomes, where do you manage your business now? Like, what is the data that you're getting in to help you understand what's happening? And where can you insert changes, control points, basically, to those processes? And they're just all over the map. And you just have to kind of sit down and figure out what's practical with your organization, with your tool set, et cetera, to innovate and to do something new. What do you think, Stephen?
So totally great. I think it's use case specific is I think where you were where you were going with that thought, Eric, which is what's the use case that I'm trying to drive? We talked a little bit about the data intensity and compute intensity of AI. I've got a friend of mine that runs a small AI natural language processing startup. Every proof of concept that he does costs him about $1.4 million in AWS to run through that proof of concept. And so, one of the things he's laser focused on is, great, how can I bring that data and compute closer to the customer to drive down cost of that POC? And I think that's a simple example. You look at, I'm sure everyone is looking at their LinkedIn. You can see the stories here. They're great. We brought our data back, or we brought our compute back. And there's great reasons for that. And then there's great reasons why you would use AWS, or if you're using Azure because you want the log management capabilities of Sentinel. So again, a lot of it's use case oriented, and being clear about what that use case is. And then as an IT team or a CIO, being able to deliver that to your organization. And one of the things that we do here in the concept of our application marketplace for our hosters is we don't care. We're big fans of regional hosters and service providers, but at the same point in time, if you're a large enterprise, you're going to have customers inside of your environment that still need AWS. And so how do you give them an application marketplace where they can either consume your data center resources at a lower cost, AWS for a particular workload need at a little bit of a higher cost, or whatever other shared service that they might need? So it's that flexibility that I think all of us are trying to create in the broader environment, whether, again, to Wally's point, whether it's colo, hyperscaler, your own data center, all of those things are driven by the workload in the application.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Tytus, I just had a thought as I was listening here a moment ago about one of the challenges in the cloud. And, as we just heard, maybe you want to use Sentinel. You have to stay on top of what functionality is being provided in these clouds. And the one Achilles heel I've seen, I won't mention any of the big cloud providers by name, but you can guess it's one of these three. One of the Achilles heels I've seen is that some of these big cloud providers will get into a particular space. They'll see, okay, this is hot. Let's build our own, basically, or maybe acquire someone, and then I'll get up and running, and then they pull the string on it, and it goes away. They're like, I've seen this happen several times now, where you're like, well, what do you mean you're taking rid of this product? It was working. They just pull the string on it, and it's gone. And that's what you don't want, right? That's the last thing you want, is to rely on a particular, and that's why people watch out for smaller companies, because they're worried it'll just go away someday, and you don't want that. But it happens to the big guys too, right, Tytus?
This is exactly why people go multi-cloud, right? Because they don't want to depend on a single vendor, and like this vendor dependency has been like the primary reason to like use multiple clouds at the same time. It's not uncommon, like for big enterprises, so that like if they decide to use public clouds mostly, it's not uncommon for them to run like some of the workloads on, let's say, AWS, but some of the others on Azure, for example, just for like even business continuity point of view, right? Like it's a myth, so that public clouds are like super resilient, right? Like we keep hearing about public cloud outages on a regular basis, right? Even though like there are a number of building concepts like in public clouds with multiple regions, availability zones, right? Like it's still not uncommon to see, for example, cloud outages, right? But what you mentioned is a valid point as well, right? So relying on like one particular product, one particular feature for all your business critical applications is like insane, right? Like being independent of the cloud vendor is the primary reason we see for people going multi-cloud. This may mean multiple public cloud providers. This may mean using public cloud and private cloud at the same time. It all depends on the use case. It all depends on the needs.
Yeah, that's right. And it changes all the time. I mean, we're going to have to just kind of pay attention to this. And, that's why we have analyst firms, for example, to do market landscapes to see, okay, these are the observability vendors you can use. These are the ticketing systems that you can use. And, they're always changing. I mean, it's quite fascinating, but that means there's a job for all of us still in the workplace, right, Stephen?
I mean, that's exactly right. As we, again, we've all said it. We're all got plenty of opportunity to modernize, whether you've got a monolithic application or whether you've, only got, Office 365 and a small data store that you're working with Wally on for whatever reason, whatever purpose. We've all got opportunities to not only create more efficiency in the marketplace, if you're an SMB, large enterprise, or you're working with customers, but also give yourself the opportunity to port, to Tytus's point, from one cloud provider to another. So, we go back, the other example here is when we were all thinking about EMC and the storage days of being locked into one storage provider, that's no longer the case. And I think we're making the case on this show right now that is, you don't need to be locked into one particular cloud provider. Right.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to provide that optionality for you as a consumer.
Yeah, no one likes lock-in, and we've got about a minute left here, Wally. I'll throw it over to you. Nobody likes lock-in. You always want to be able to pull out. And that's, frankly, what cloud native is supposed to mean is that you have functionality that you can take here and put it over there, and it should work with reasonably small amount of effort, right?
Yeah, that's what it's supposed to mean. I think Stephen and Tytus are probably better experts than I am on that, but I would argue that one of the reasons they have great companies is that maybe the conceptual promise of Kubernetes and any technology that's supposed to be the same in every location,
right?
We're maybe not quite there yet. And it takes a little bit of sauce on top of that to actually really have an application that works on this person's version of Kubernetes versus that one. We're getting better for sure.
Right.
But I don't think we're in this magic place where you can pick up a yellow logo or a yellow Lego piece from hyperscaler A and just plug it into hyperscaler B because, oh, actually they don't support the same API or they have different performance and things like that.
That's right. Well, I think we have a good topic for the podcast bonus segment coming up too. I've noticed recently in one of our SaaS providers, you load in a bunch of HTML and it'll say, oh, you have some errors. Should we fix these for you? You click a button, it fixes them for you. I'm like, that's what I'm talking about, people. Don't touch that dial. DM Radio continues.